Morning, guys. Today we're going to take a look at page 8 of your Unit 4 Classwork packet. Now, in the last video, we took a look at how, if you had parallel lines that were cut through by a transversal, you knew certain things about the angle types, right? Like we made that little T-chart and we said that congruent angles, right? There are 3 different types that would fall into that category, and those were corresponding, alternate interior, and alternate exterior. Similarly, there was one angle type that fell into the supplementary category, and that would be the consecutive interior, also known as same side interior. Now we're going to take a look at the, I don't want to say it's something new, but it's kind of like the reverse case of this. Previously, we were told that we had parallel lines, and that when we have parallel lines cut through by a transversal, we know things about the angle types. Now, we're actually going to tell you something about the angles, and we're going to ask you to determine if the lines are parallel. Okay, the big overarching vocab word that sums this up is something called the converse, which for right now you could think of as just reversing the conditional statements we talked about earlier. Okay, so when we talk about on page 8, the corresponding angles converse, okay? I'm just going to do this really quickly, okay, because it's actually really simple and I think you'll get the hang of it right away. I want you to understand what we're talking about, okay? So corresponding angles converse would basically do something like this. They would tell you in a diagram, okay, or in a proof or something like that, that corresponding angles are congruent. Now, if that's the case, here's what that tells us. By the converse of the corresponding angles postulate, which is a lot of blah, 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 what it tells us is this. It tells us that the two lines are parallel. The only way that this differs from what we did before is that previously they gave us this. Previously, they gave us that the lines were parallel, and they asked us to prove that the angles themselves were congruent, right? The only difference now is that now they're going to ask us to prove that the lines are parallel by using the converse. So this is really not all that difficult. The only thing I will say is that, like, if you're struggling on a proof-based problem to choose between the regular and the converse, if they're asking you to prove that angles are congruent, use the regular theorem, so just corresponding angles. By contrast, if they're asking you to prove lines parallel, use the converse. That's like an exam tip you probably want to write down, so let me say it again. If they ask you to prove that angles are congruent, use the regular theorems. If they ask you by contrast to simply prove that two lines are parallel, then you use the converse, okay? Now, just to take a brief look at how this would work, okay? At the bottom of page 8, let's just take a look at example number 1, okay? Here's how you would do this. Example 1, I want you to tell me what kind of angles they give me. Well, let's take a look. I don't know about you guys, but they give me this angle down here and this angle up here. Those are alternate exterior angles. So because they're asking me, right, or they tell me that alternate exterior angles are congruent, I can say by the converse of alternate exterior angles, those two lines are parallel. Similarly, for example number 2, they give me corresponding angles that are congruent. So I would say by the converse of the corresponding angles postulate, those two lines are parallel. Where you got to be careful though, guys, is something like example 4. Example 4 tries to trick us. What they give us are vertical angles. Here's the thing about vertical angles though. They're always congruent. Let me say that again. Vertical angles are always congruent, right? So vertical angles alone are not enough to prove two lines parallel. Instead, you would have to use something else. So for number 4, or example 4 on that page, you'd have to just say, not enough information. Can't say. Okay? All right. Now, in the next video, we're actually going to take a look at how this applies to proofs, okay? So you'll recall that we took a look at 2-column proofs earlier when we were doing the algebraic proof, solving an equation using properties of equality. Now we're going to apply that same concept in the next video to filling in 2-column proofs involving angles.